Welcome everyone to our Food Safety for Farmers webinar. This is a series of podcast episodes and webinars on the Road to Safe and Healthy Food podcast project at Florida Organic Growers. We're very, very happy to have with us today Keith Schneider and Michelle Danyluk. They are professors and extension specialists at the Food Science and Human Nutrition Department at the University of Florida. Thank you, Keith and Michelle, for being with us today.
Thank you, JC.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
So today we're going to be doing a deeper dive into the microbiology and post-harvest water use as it pertains to the Food Safety Modernization Act rules and regulations. We've actually talked to you before about both of these topics on our podcast series, but today our agenda, we hope to sort of provide, sort of more in-depth and additional information to our farmers as it pertains to these two topics. So once again, thank you so much for being with us. So with that, would you mind, giving us a little bit of background and information about what it is that you do at the University of Florida?
Michelle, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I can go first. So like you mentioned, JC, I'm a professor and extension specialist at the University of Florida. Like Keith, I specialize in microbial food safety. So we work very closely with organisms that cause outbreaks related to food. And both Keith and I have focused a lot lately on working with fresh fruits and vegetables and really understanding some of the risk factors and how to control pathogens or things that cause disease in people within the sort of environment that fresh fruits and vegetables are grown and harvested and packed in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and again, I'm Keith Schneider from the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition up in Gainesville, Florida. Yeah, my background is really in produce safety, microbiology, just like Michelle. We joke that we're partners in crime. We've been working on produce safety now for must be going on 15 years now, close.
15 years, yeah.
I've been here a little bit longer than that, but we're close. We've been working on each other's grants for about 15 years. Besides produce, though, we're also looking at pathogen survival in soil. That's another project that we've been working on a lot the last couple of years.
And you're both part of the Southern Center, is that correct? And maybe perhaps you can tell us what that is, so those farmers that are tuning in understand that work that pertains to the Southern Center.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You go.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the Southern Center and there's actually another component called the Lead Regional Coordination Center, Communication Center. Michelle and I have been working on this. This is ending up our 6th year. Michelle was the initial person to get funding from USDA 3 years ago, and I'll let her talk about the Southern Center in just a second. We had then applied for and got the Lead Regional Center, which was a second round funding, which again coordinates with the other 4 regional centers around the U.S. And just recently, we've gotten a 3rd round of funding for the next 3 years. Again, working with all the food safety outreach projects in or given out by USDA, including the one that's funding this podcast. So yeah, we do a lot of communication with not only the institutions in the Southeast, but we also serve as the conduit for all the other centers around the country, coordinating and allowing these projects to share their results, their insights, and again provide that conduit for information sharing. And since Michelle literally runs the Southern Center, I'll let her talk about that portion of it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Keith. So the Southern Center, or the Southern Regional Center for FSMA Training, which I think is its official name, we always just call it the Southern Center, is really a consortium of universities and NGOs across the Southern US. So Texas, Oklahoma, over across Arkansas, Kentucky, and then Virginia, and then south, that includes Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. And it's a consortium of folks who work in food safety training, specifically focused around FSMA and two FSMA rules, the produce safety rule that we're talking about now, and the preventive control rule that you'll hear about later on in podcasts. And it brings together the folks that are doing the training and doing the education on those rural areas to try to have them share best practices and to try to build capacity of those trainers so that you never feel like you don't have a team. And so I think as you'll see, right, there's a lot of really complicated topics and nuanced topics within these new FSMA rules. And so we really wanted to build a consortium or a group of folks that are there for you to reach out to if you ever have a question. So it's almost like establishing a network of folks so you can phone a friend in case you don't know the answer as a extension specialist or an educator yourself. You've got a group of people who you can reach out to answer that question. And so there's 23 institutions and NGOs involved now across the southern region. So it's a large group of us working together, and a great group to be involved in, great group to reach out to if you have questions, because like I said, there's a lot of us involved, so we can usually find an answer for you. One of the things we do, and if you've been to any of our Southern Center training courses, is you'll know that we spend a lot of time evaluating how our programs work, and we do that through pre and post tests to measure knowledge gain. We do that through different evaluations you fill out, and the reason we subject you all to all those different evaluation tools is it so we can show to USDA that the money they've invested in us to build out and really decrease the cost of our training programs is worth it, and that you are all moving forward in this area. So we do great things at the Southern Center. We have a website that we'll link to in the show notes. But we list a lot of upcoming trainings across the southern region there and have a bunch of resource documents available.
Yeah,
Great.
I was going to just get a shout out. There are about 44 participants, active participants in the Southern Center right now, who do all this work for very little money. It's almost volunteer work. So we have a really good group of like-minded individuals who participate in these trainings and attend all these meetings, and it's really their work that we're kind of we're riding on right now, because without them we couldn't have the center. So a shout out to all those folks who are part of the center. Absolutely.
So do we then maybe can just get into exactly what the produce safety rule is all about, and you can explain how we got here basically?
Well, sure. I'll give a brief introduction, and then Michelle can kind of like clean up my mess here when I'm done. The produce safety rule is part of the new FDA Food Safety Modernization Act, which was signed into law in 2011. There are a lot of different moving parts to that act, but there are 7 major parts to the rule, and one of them happens to be the produce safety rule. That really is a codified set of guidelines for producing produce safely. Again, as the name implies. If you're familiar with good agricultural practices, this really codifies good agricultural practices and sets them down in the produce safety rule, and gives farmers guidelines for producing produce in the safest manner possible.
Yeah, so I think Keith is right on there. Like he mentioned, signed into law FSMA in 2011. Final rule went into effect January of 2016. We saw farm inspections for the largest farms start back in 2018. And I think now they're inspecting all the farms, although certainly with COVID, a lot of inspections have been delayed. And we do have two parts of the rule where there's been a little bit delay and they aren't enforcing them yet. The first of those is agricultural water. Initially was given a delay until January of this year, January 22. Still don't have a final rule on that yet. So FDA is using something called enforcement discretion, which means that on their inspections, they're still not inspecting for agricultural water. Again, we don't have a final rule. We're not sure when we're going to get a final rule on that, but we don't expect inspection, and that was a hard thing to just say, expect inspection for at least a few more years on that till they sort out agricultural water. The other section of the rule where we still have some uncertainty and we don't have a final rule written is around use of raw manures and waiting periods and pre-harvest intervals for raw manures. And FDA has indicated that they will sort of push people towards the NOP standards until they finalize that section of the rule. But Keith, I don't think we have a timeline for when that section of the rule is going to be finalized yet. So folks keep using those NOP standards in the meantime.
Yeah, and if you hear the term biological soil amendments of animal origin, and sometimes you'll hear that pronounced as BASAU, that's exactly what Michelle's talking about.
Yeah, and in fact, I just wanted to tell our audience that Florida Organic Growers held a webinar recently to sort of introduce everyone about some of these changes. But please stay tuned, because as Michelle and Keith are both stating, it's not finalized yet. So and there still is room for comments, as I understand it, and time to do that. So please stay tuned. Visit our website for more information. I also now want to sort of remind people about our podcast. So on the first episode, we talked about microbiology, and just to sort of review what it was that we talked about during that podcast episode. We discussed pathogens and microorganisms, the concerns over these microorganisms, and microbe testing and prevention. So we thought we want to discuss a little bit further exactly what are pathogens, and what you think farmers need to know when it comes to pathogens on their produce and in their farm.
I guess the simplest definition is pathogen is something that produces disease. So human pathogens produce disease in humans. We have plant pathogens that produce disease in plants. But typically, when we're talking the produce safety, we're really talking about human safety. So we're trying to protect against those organisms that are going to cause illness or injury to individuals. And
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and when we talk about food safety, we often talk about foodborne pathogens, because these are pathogens that are specifically transmitted through food, through consumption of food products. So there's a lot of human pathogens out there. Not all of those human pathogens are foodborne. So when we talk food safety, we talk about foodborne pathogens. COVID is a great example, right? Not transmitted through food, so not considered a foodborne pathogen.
Yeah, it's a person to person, which was not good that one wasn't a foodborne pathogen. But yeah, and they come in different types. Typically, we lump them into things like bacteria, viruses, and then parasites. Those are the three main categories that we see foodborne pathogens. Mm-hmm. And there's, we talk about all the illnesses that you hear or read about in the news, but there really aren't that many. Again, there's probably about 30 or so that you hear over and over again. There's a lot more that can cause illness or injury, but they're very rare. And we're typically dealing with a small group of, again, bacteria, viruses, and parasites over and over again. Mm-hmm. But again, these are things that cause illness or injury. And honestly, we've known about them about 100 years or so. So they've sort of evolved along with our knowledge of microbiology. Mm-hmm. And again, we do our best to try to keep them out of the food chain.
Right. So exactly. So I guess one of the things that, and you just pointed out, are they dangerous? And that is, based on, that broad definition. But certainly all pathogens are bad. And I think that definitely should be something that we can all agree on. What about a microorganism? What is the, sort of the simplest definition of what a microorganism is?
Yeah, so its simplest definition is that it is a single-celled organism, right? So it exists as a single cell. Now that single cell can exist in a colony of many cells, but each of those cells is a different organism, and it's something that we can't see typically with our bare eye. So microorganism implies microscopic, which means that we need to use a microscope to be able to see them when they're each grown individually. And so it can include all those things Keith mentioned that could be a foodborne pathogen. It includes viruses, it includes bacterium, and it includes protozoa. It can also include some fungi. But not all those microorganisms out there are pathogenic. In fact, the majority of microorganisms out there are beneficial for us. We each have a huge number of microorganisms that lives on our bodies and in our bodies all the time. So don't think that just because there's a bacteria there or a microorganism, it's pathogenic or it's bad. The majority of microorganisms in there are really beneficial to us.
So that means you were here to discuss those microorganisms that are of concern when it comes to fresh produce. And these are some of the examples of what those microorganisms are. Can you sort of tell us a little bit about some of these and why they're so problematic and a concern?
Sure. Again, these are kind of the three main categories I just mentioned. Bacteria are probably the biggest one, the ones you hear about in the news the most. There are things like pathogenic E. coli, and there's one in particular, O157H7, and there are many different strains. You can have O26, O44. This particular one, which is O strain 157, just happens to be particularly nasty, and we've seen this a lot in undercooked meat products, and occasionally we've seen it come up in produce with produce that has been come in contact with manure or fecal material. But we have things like salmonella, which is very, very common. Almost you name a food, and it's probably had salmonella on it at one point. Another is Listeria monocytogenes. People probably heard of Shigella. But these are just some of the more common bacterial single-celled microorganisms that are found on food occasionally. And when we're talking about number of illnesses, to kind of put it in perspective, in the U.S. we have about 50 million cases of foodborne illness, and bacteria are a pretty big source of those. Salmonella is about 1.5 million cases a year. E. coli maybe 80,000 to 100,000. So they make up a large portion. And then we have the viruses, things like norovirus and rotavirus and hepatitis. Norovirus is one of the most common foodborne illness that you're going to find. It accounts for roughly half of all the foodborne illnesses. So if you've ever had like a stomach bug, and again, you've had the typical diarrhea or vomiting or nausea, it's 50-50 that you probably come out with a norovirus. Again, that's how common it is. And then we have the parasites. And if we're dealing with single-cell parasites, these single-cell parasites are typically protozoan in nature, things like Giardia, Cryptosporidium, or Cyclospora. But there are also multicellular parasites like roundworms or flukes or other types of foodborne parasites. But again, the most common ones we find in food are these single-celled protozoans. So not all protozoans are parasitic, and not all parasites are single-celled, but the ones that we deal with mainly are these single-cell protozoans. But these are just a small list of, of those 30 or so that I've talked about. This is just just a couple of ones that you might hear about in the news.
Yeah, and I think we're all sort of at least have heard of some of these names before. Here's an illustration. Do you want to sort of point out some of the things that I think, farmers should sort of pay attention to?
Sure. I'm going to start off, and I'm going to let Michelle finish up for me on this one. So a lot of the organisms that make us sick come from feces. They kind of grow in the gut of warm-blooded animals, right? Actually, any animals. So, and what ends up happening is feces gets on the food. We ingest that feces. The organisms then start growing inside of us, and then we start shedding them in our feces, and the cycle continues. This is called the fecal-oral route of contamination. A lot of the pathogens that we're talking about belong to a group of microorganisms known as Enterobacteriaceae. And again, there are certain, this ring structure you see, there are things known as coliform bacteria, which belong to this group. And actually, coliforms are not necessarily found in the gut flora. They're found outside in the dirt. Some of them can be of gut origin, but a lot of coliforms are just, just out in the environment. Depending on certain growth characteristics and what foods they're out there, what kind of sugars they like to eat, and what temperatures they grow at, there's another smaller group within the coliforms known as fecal coliforms that can grow at elevated temperatures, which sort of mimic body conditions. So coliforms, which are that can grow outside in the environment, typically grow at lower temperatures, but fecal coliforms can tolerate a higher temperature because again, they're found inside the gut, and we tend to be warmer than the outside. So these fecal coliforms indicate these coliforms that are again able to grow at higher temperatures, and then within that group, there's another subset, which is where we find E. coli. Now, all of us have E. coli in our gut. For the most part, it is benign. It does really nothing. It just kind of hangs out in our gut. We don't bother them. They don't bother us. And they're just there. And we find it in meat products. We find it, again, within our gut. But there's a even smaller subset of these organisms known as pathogenic E. coli. Some of these old E. coli have gone bad. Some of them have actually borrowed genes from Shigella. They're kind of sharing bad information. And they become pathogenic. They actually do damage inside of our gut. There's a whole host of these things that we find. And one of them happens to be that nasty one we just talked about, the E. coli 157H7, which can do some, again, is not only can make you sick, but also causes, a high mortality rate. So again,
go back, JC, one slide first before we move on to this.
Yeah. So when we talk about this, so when we start looking for all these things in the environment, we narrow things down. So we want to try to find these microorganisms, and the ones typically that we start looking for, the indicator organisms, ones we search for, are fecal origin, because if we find feces in the water or on food, there's a good chance we're going to find some of the other organisms that are some of the nasty ones, because again, they're coming from fecal origin. But that's not always the case. And this is where I'm going to let Michelle jump in.
Yeah, and so I think the reason to really understand and look at this figure like this is because of those indicator organisms like Keith talked about. And when we talk about testing a little bit more, when you look at what a buyer might be asking you to test for in your product, or test for on the food contact surfaces around your product, or test for in the water, they might ask you to be testing for E. coli, which we would call a generic E. coli. They might ask you to be testing for a fecal coliform. They might ask you to be testing for a coliform. In fact, a lot of water test results that you get ask for folks to sort of give you a coliform count, whether you need it or not, because like he said, coliforms are expected out in the environment. And some buyers and some testing requirements might even ask you to do an EB count, is what they would say, but they really mean an Enterobacteriaceae count, where they want to know the total count of the entire sort of Enterobacteriaceae on a surface or on a product. So understanding the difference between these different things and understanding what you're being asked for and how it sort of fits into where these different pathogens might sit, I think might be important for growers to understand, so you're not just testing for what you're being told to test for, but have a little bit of an understanding of why you're being told to test for. Like Keith said, we would test for E. coli or a fecal coliform if we're looking for indication of feces. Sometimes in manufactured food, we test for things like coliforms or Enterobacteriaceae because they're indicative of filth or dirt from the outside.
Mhm.
We don't see that so much in produce, again, because our products are grown outside and they've got coliforms all over them because that's where coliforms come from, right? But you might see those terms come up when you're talking to someone who's asking you to test your product.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, one last thing I want to add here is, again, if we find E. coli, then basically we found feces on that product or in that water sample. And if E. coli is present, there's a good chance of something, let's say, like salmonella being present. It's not a one-to-one correlation. It's not even a really good correlation, but it's not bad. So when we find feces, there's a good chance we may find some of those other pathogens. And this keeps us from having to test for a whole, all those other, 29 other ones that are commonly found out there. The big problem here is, you see in this diagram, there's that little bug down there, Listeria monocytogenes. That bacteria falls outside of this little circle, which means you may have 0 E. coli, but you still may have Listeria monocytogenes. And when we get to that, we'll talk about why that one is so important.
Mhm. Mhm. And so here's in this slide sort of, illustrates what you've been discussing, the sources of the illnesses and some of the symptoms, which, we never really want to have to go through this, but I think this next few slides illustrate, first of all, sort of, the disease or microorganism, what the source of that illness may be, and some of the symptoms. Do any of you want to sort of add to what exactly it is that you sort of want to let our farmers know when it comes to the particular pathogens?
Well, I'll start off with this one. 0157 or E. coli 0157H7 is one you don't want. And
Yeah.
what I think we should stress to the farmers is one reason, again, Michelle and I do all this, and we're so focused on food safety or preventing foodborne illnesses, because organisms like this, while illnesses are exceedingly rare, and again, what by rare, there's about 80,000 cases a year, so it's not that rare. But this particular organism is very deadly, especially to young children. For most healthy adults, the symptomology is not that bad. It can be. Again, fever, abdominal spasm, shivering, and all the stuff that you see there. Basically, it's gastroenteritis is kind of the generic term for all of these things put together. But this particular strain of E. coli, remember, not all E. coli are pathogenic. But this particular strain can cause something known as hemolytic uremic syndrome, HUS or HUS. And what this does is it causes scarring in the tubules of the kidneys, especially in young children. And this scarring can cause through renal failure. And then, as somebody seems to be getting healthier and getting better, they can end up dying.
Oh my gosh.
So it's one of those ones where we're always looking for if, in fact, there's any case of HUS out there after an outbreak of 0157H7. But it's deadly, and it's attacking children. Not that attacking adults is a good thing, but it's just one of those things where you don't want to be that farmer who ends up with this on their food product, because again, not only is it just bad financially for your business, again, just the trauma of, again, making somebody that sick or actually leading to the death of somebody is just traumatic.
Correct. Okay.
And so I think, yeah, the other takeaway, it's not to lessen the trauma of an E. coli 0157H7 infection, but the takeaway for me, for a grower, when they think about E. coli 0157H7, this is something that's going to come from feces, right? This is that fecal oral route Keith talked about. It's highly linked to cattle, some other wild animals, deer, wild pigs. But when you think about risk or sources of E. coli 0157H7, we really need to focus in on those fecal risks from different types of animals. And that's a little bit different than our next organism that we're going to talk about.
Salmonella.
Yeah. Salmonella, my favorite one. If one can have a favorite foodborne pathogen, salmonella would be mine. It is, like he said when he talked about it earlier on, if you can name a food product, it's had a salmonella problem in the past. Ones to point out on there, right? Chocolate is perhaps the most sad, but there's been salmonella outbreaks associated with chocolate in the past. And it also is a fecal oral route, but it also tends to spend we tend to find it in the environment a lot more frequently than we find E. coli 015787, especially here in Florida. And so once it gets in the environment, it can last there for a long time. And we see it in a bunch of different types of animals, not just those warm-blooded ones that Keith talked about. We see this reptilian sources and a bunch of different sources. And again, we find it very, very frequently. Symptoms of this tend to be a little bit less severe in general than those associated with 015787. We see lower mortality rates associated with it, although they certainly can happen. But gastroenteritis is again the symptom here. So abdominal pain, diarrhea, nausea, occasionally vomiting. Again, symptoms typically last just a few days, although they can last longer. So it's also not pleasant to get, but tends to not be quite as deadly as E. coli. And like Keith mentioned earlier, we see a lot of illnesses from salmonella every year, well over 1 million.
Yeah, one thing to also point out too, though, is like when Michelle and I were always out, lecturing and doing workshops. A lot of times, we always hear, "Well, I haven't made anybody sick," and our answer back is, "How do you know?" If you've given somebody salmonella, and unless it's a very large outbreak, the vast majority of the 50 million illness cases that I talked about earlier on go unreported. The vast majority, 90% or so, again, really don't ever get reported or counted. One individual gets sick, you're not going to know about it. So we always want to stress that point. Just because you haven't been part of an outbreak doesn't mean you haven't made people sick, which is why we want people to be as cautious as they possibly can to reduce these cases. Because again, this is going to end up about like 1.5 million cases a year. And the mortality rate is low, but you're still going to end up with 300 to 500 people dying every year from salmonella.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about Listeria?
Okay, so this is sort of the complete opposite. Remember, this is the one that fell outside the circle. So this one isn't necessarily found with feces. So you can have a work surface that's completely free of fecal contamination, and it's just dirty. And we find this stuff with this organism out in the environment. One of the largest, most deadliest outbreaks in the U.S. occurred in 2011 out in Colorado with cantaloupe. And depending on what source, and it's anywhere between 30 and 34 people died. So at minimum, 30 people died from eating fresh cantaloupe that was contaminated with Listeria monocytogenes. Now, here's something crazy. When you think about salmonella, we just talked about 1.5 million cases a year, almost 400 to 500 people dying every year. Listeria monocytogenes, only around 1,200, maybe 2,000 cases a year, the same number of people dying. So the mortality rate for this organism is just the opposite of salmonella. It's very high. It can be anywhere from 15 to 30% of the people. If you get this, more than likely you're ending up at the doctor or in the hospital. It's very rare. Again, not many cases a year, but when it does happen, the consequences are dire. It has a lot of unique characteristics that it can do. How it hides within the immune system. It can present typical gastroenteritis, but it can be much, much worse. And again, this one is one of those ones where not only does it affect individuals who are at risk, and let's go back and just kind of make that point, the at-risk populations are the very young, the very old, the immunocompromised, and the fourth group is pregnant women. This particular organism affects women, especially in the third trimester, and actually causes or can cause spontaneous abortion in women if they become infected with this organism. So again, not very common, but the consequences are dire. So again, when we talk about sanitizing surfaces, make sure surfaces are clean. This is why we worry. What keeps Michelle and I up at night.
Mm-hmm. Mhm.
Yeah, Listeria is one that we worry an awful lot about, especially for that pregnant woman
Mhm.
category, because
Mhm.
it just the loss of a fetus is tragic.
Of course,
Always.
of course. So Michelle and Keith, one of the things that we hear from farmers is, so which crops are more susceptible, of these three main pathogens?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, and I find it interesting because of the word susceptible. And I would argue the word susceptible, none of the crops are more susceptible to these three main pathogens. But what I would say is that we do see different crop types that are associated with different pathogens more frequently than not, right? So when we think about E. coli O157H7 outbreaks, we tend to think about leafy greens, right? We almost see annually or twice annually these large outbreaks of E. coli O157H7 associated with leafy greens coming out of the West Coast. When we think about salmonella, we think about a wider variety of crop types. And so, right, if you think about recent outbreaks of salmonella in fresh produce, we can think about the onion outbreak and the peach outbreaks from 2020. There have been recent cucumber outbreaks. And if we go back a little bit further, we saw a ton of salmonella and tomato outbreaks back in the early 2000s, about just over a decade and a half ago. Listeria monocytogenes, we are seeing a little bit, we see more rarely in produce outbreaks. I think, like he said, we have that big cantaloupe outbreak we can point to. There was an apple outbreak in fresh apples where we can point to. And then occasionally a leafy green outbreak. What we do see more is recalls associated with Listeria monocytogenes. And again, they're in a lot of fresh cut products. I think when we think about which crops are susceptible, the fresh cut ones are very susceptible. We see them associated with Listeria more frequently than anything else. Yeah.
And what about testing for E. coli or salmonella or Listeria?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Keith and I are both going to recommend that you don't test for these foodborne pathogens. How you would test for it, you'd find yourself a contract lab, you'd tell them, I need an E. coli O157H7 test, or I need a salmonella test, and they will go through a series of testing protocols designed to tease those microorganisms out of the product. But in general, we don't test our food for foodborne pathogens. Keith, do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the reasons, again, the whole proverbial needle in a haystack, we typically look for those indicator organisms, things like E. coli, which indicate the presence of fecal contamination. Again, not all the organisms that we were concerned about are of fecal origin, but if we find feces, again, E. coli on the food product or in the water that we happen to be testing, we're likely to find or there's potential for finding a potential pathogen. If we start looking for individual pathogens, say like salmonella, we're going to miss E. coli. If we test for E. coli, we may miss salmonella or shigella. And the farmer would spend lots and lots of money looking for these individual organisms and may miss a more potentially harmful microorganism. We can test all day for salmonella and never find cyclospora because, again, it's a totally different organism. It's a totally different test. If we look for cyclospora, we're going to miss salmonella. And occasionally you're going to find, especially if we're testing water, we may find pathogens in the water that really don't have a public health significance associated with them. So occasionally, if you start looking for organisms in the environment, we can find, trace amounts of these things, but it doesn't necessarily equate to risk. So it's one of those things where actually testing for specific pathogens, I'm not a fan of. I don't know it's money well spent. Occasionally your buyer's going to ask you, hey, I'm not going to buy your product unless you do test it for salmonella or E. coli. They may ask you for a monitoring program that's looking for Listeria monocytogenes. But testing a food product really is not going to tell you whether that food is safe or not. These things happen so rarely that if you do find one, it's, again, you're just very unlucky. But for the most time, you're going to get a negative response back and think everything is fine, when in fact, again, you may have this organism on some other portion of your field. And again, it gives you kind of a false sense of security. So again, we prefer, again, being preventive in nature, where we go out there and we do all those good agricultural practices that are specified in the produce safety rule. And that's a better way of making sure that your food is safe.
Yeah, you can never forget that the testing is destructive testing, right? So if I have an apple that I'm testing, to test the apple, I have to destroy the apple. So I've just proven that apple that I destroyed was safe and it's not going out there. So we really, you can't prove a product safe through testing.
Okay. But since, we don't really need to test for these pathogens, what about something like the Listeria? And what should, our farmers know about Listeria, for example?
So yeah, typically, if you wanted to look for an indicator of Listeria, right, like Keith and I have mentioned, it's not a pathogen that's commonly found in feces. It really is an organism that's found out in the environment, especially in areas that aren't cleaned and sanitized frequently, and where you can get, and they tend to be moist or damp, and they really can build up Listeria biofilm. So when we test for Listeria monocytogenes, what we would encourage people to test for is Listeria species. And so Listeria monocytogenes is one organism in a family of 20 different organisms, or at least 20 different organisms. And so we sort of test for that bigger family of Listeria, and we look for it because if we find those other types of Listeria there, it means that the environment is such that Listeria monocytogenes could also be there and grow and be present. So when we're looking at sanitation in our facilities, we test for Listeria species to look and see how well we're cleaning and sanitizing to sort of prevent Listeria in general from being in our environment. And then if we don't find Listeria species, we assume that we're controlling for Listeria monocytogenes.
And I think the same applies to E. coli, right?
Yeah, again, if we have E. coli present on a surface or on a food product, again, the potential for having a pathogenic E. coli exists. But again, if I test for 0157, I may miss 026 or 45 or 0104. So it's one of those things where if we test for a single one, we're going to miss all those others. This way, if we test for just a generic E. coli, that means those conditions are right, that, again, we didn't do a good enough job, or that portion of the product that we harvested came in contact with fecal material, and we might have a pathogen present.
Well, Michelle and Keith, we're so thankful for the time you spent with us today, going over all of this very important and useful information. And we remind our listeners and our audience that there's a lot of resources out there that you can find and use. The FDA is one of those resources, and of course, when we were saying earlier, the Southern Center, University of Florida, both Keith and Michelle are people that are experts. They love talking about these topics, as you can see. So we invite you also to contact them and talk to them if you have any more questions. We also invite everyone that's listening to tune in to our Food Safety for Farmers podcast episodes and more webinars. And I do want to end really quickly, and I apologize. This is something I should have pointed out to everyone when we started, is that we want to acknowledge that this webinar series is supported by the Food Safety Outreach Program grant, which is part of the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. We will be doing a lot more episodes and webinars, and you get to listen to Keith and Michelle again. So we certainly appreciate the time you spent with us today. Thank you so much, Keith and Michelle.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.